Hey, welcome back, everybody. Of course, this is Dr. Keith McNally, and this is the Question Guy podcast, and this is season two, and so I'm so happy for that. I'm here with Damien Mulligan, and hopefully I got that name right because I'm getting better with names. And Damien works at the intersection of leadership and climate change, and I'm so wanting to have this conversation because that's an intersection that I don't cross very often, and I don't even touch climate change at all in any of the conversations that I've had. So Damien's going to give me, at the very least, some education today, and I'm very appreciative. But before we get into that conversation, Damien, could you give us some
Thank you.
background about who you are and how you got to this point?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm based in Wicklow in Ireland. I'm married with a wife, two daughters, and a dog. But the majority of my 25-year career was spent in the software industry, focusing on customer experience and customer outcomes. So I led technical support, customer success, customer account management, and escalation management teams. And I enjoyed that the actual software industry is full of innovation, and software itself is full of possibility to make our lives better. And we hear and read a lot these days, particularly for young people, how they're choosing to have a career of purpose. And I can relate to that because I found that over time, the purpose that I'd created, which was enabling successful customers, while I'm passionate about it, is not my purpose.
Really?
So I actually made a decision to step out of the corporate world into the world of entrepreneurship. And as it happens, as you mentioned, I've started two distinct ventures, but I don't see them being very far apart, which is the interesting bit, the segue between leadership and climate change, and how they I suppose drive our behaviors in some instances, and how our behaviors then become part of what we drive for the future also.
Mm. So software and climate change, they don't marry each other very well, at least not that I'm aware of. Can you kind of get into, I mean, was it literally a jump out of industry and for some reason this became an interest?
It's not really. So I've always enjoyed the natural world. My wife and I have always attempted to engender in our kids a sense of wonder at the world. Like many children, at least in Ireland and parts of Europe, they're very aware of climate change, and they
Okay.
know how the ecosystem relies on balance, and they also have a solid grasp, or a grasp to the extent that they can, on the damage we're doing to the planet. And I didn't have an answer for them when they asked me, why are we not doing things differently? Why don't
Wow.
people change? And I set about using my leadership and change management experience to start a company that would help people with eco anxiety specifically. So there's a group of people who desire to see change around climate or action around climate, but suffer from anxiety because it's not happening, or because they're not part of making it happen. And my intention is to be able to take them on a journey where they can live that life of purpose and impact, but have an impact on climate action as well at the same time. And how that relates to the software industry is, I believe that software tools are a great way of connecting people. So we have social networks, we have professional networks, we have a lot of different types of apps that can enable us. And effectively, the way to look at the app that we want to create, we're in the early stages of this yet, but the app that we want to create is that it's kind of like the confluence of, I'll say something like Fitbit or Strava for engaging people in a a set of actions. In that case, it's around fitness or around health,
Hmm.
um, and then also incorporate the community element. So if you looked at a LinkedIn or a Facebook or something like that, and then give them a set of resources and tools, so a to-do list almost, to actually be able to tie those things together. So climate action, but also mindfulness around their own emotions around climate change,
Mm.
and then taking them on a journey to help them be part of that climate action, feel comfortable that there are other people around them also involved in that, and take them into uncomfortable action as well, perhaps, which is getting engaged in the larger ecosystem, or perhaps political advocacy, or whatever actions that might have a broader influence in their society, in their community, or perhaps on a global stage as well.
Well, I like the fact that you mentioned that this is a journey. And so
Mm.
I think more and more, especially with the conversations that I'm having, is that people recognize that their life is taking a different journey.
Yeah.
A lot of it because of the pandemic, and I know that we're kind of that seems to be even now today a foreign idea for many of us. It seems to be have gone away,
Yeah.
even though in some areas of the world it's still kind of present and it's
Mm.
still a very present tense. But because of that, it has facilitated different types of changes with different people.
Yeah.
Um, and so I recognize that people are on a journey, but I want to go back to something that you said earlier, and I think it's most appropriate, our next generation. And you
Mm.
gave the example of your daughters. And so I
Yeah.
have a daughter who's 12. Um, Now, like I said, climate change is not a conversation I have, even in my own family.
Mhm.
But you did have it. And
Mm.
so your daughters came to you and said, why aren't we doing something differently? And that sounded to me like the catalyst maybe of you taking a deeper dive into the reality of climate change and really trying to find out the
Mm.
answer to your daughter's questions. Can you tell me about
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah. And I considered the question, and I suppose my first answer was, well, they kind of don't understand the way the world works, and we've got economic systems based around, the way things work, the way industry works, the way business works.
Right.
But then when I looked at it in a little bit more detail, that obviously is a very basic way to look at it, I suppose. But when I looked in a little bit more detail, there are many people who want to do something about climate change. We talk a lot about it in the EU in particular. There are a lot of activities from governments and from the EU itself, attempting to ensure that we are looking to the future in a different way than we might have done up until now.
Okay.
And effectively, I think it's a change management problem. And because change management was something that I was heavily involved in, particularly in the last 8 to 10 years in my career, I started to think about some of the reasons why people don't change. And you've pointed out one of them, for instance, which is that there's a psychological distance. If you're not talking about it, it's something that's distant from you. So we're
Yes.
not necessarily aware on a day-to-day basis of extreme flooding in places like Pakistan, like happened recently, or the fact that in France during this year, during heat waves, high numbers of people who were vulnerable
Mhm.
passed away because of the inability to deal with the temperature.
Mhm.
And this is where it comes into the question of leadership as well, because I think in each of us is a leader. And it doesn't have to be that you need to have necessarily followers trotting along behind you. This is not like a duck on the
Mama Duck, right?
mama duck with the
Yeah.
ducklings behind, heading towards the lake. Our actions demonstrate leadership in day-to-day life. I believe that everybody has areas in which they are a leader to some extent, and my view is that if we can bring that potential out in people, they will exhibit it and influence those around them through those small examples of leadership. And that's kind of where the unlikely or unusual confluence of climate change and leadership actually, for me, become a reality. Because I think if I can, and we, when I say we, ELTC.Earth, so the company that we've started is currently called ELTC.Earth. Every little thing counts.
Oh,
And in the
wow.
context,
Wait, what? Say that
every,
again.
every little thing counts.
Eh, Okay, and that's the acronym. That was really good. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
That almost went over my head. I'm sorry, but that was really cool.
That's quite all right. That's quite all right. So it's one that we like, but I think we may end up moving from because people tend to get tongue tied a little bit with it. But we'll probably use that tagline because I think it's an important one.
Yes.
changes happen through individual change management in an organization is effectively getting people behind the vision. It does no change happens without people behind it. And fundamentally, anybody who leads any kind of change, it is about starting small, getting people engaged, and building up around it. And I almost looked at this from the point of view of John Cotter's change management principles when I started looking at this to a certain extent, because it is about getting people engaged, getting them started on that journey, and then getting them motivated to continue to be on it and become leaders in their own right. Because I think that, as I said, everybody has that potential or that ability to be a leader. And what better thing is there than leading in relation to something that will have a positive influence on our future and the future of our children?
And I agree. In conversations that I'm having with my colleagues, the colleagues closer to me,
Mm-hmm.
personally, and professionally, is that we kind of marry leadership with just being human. And so we each of us has a responsibility to ourselves, our family, and then to the world around us. And so some people may see that hierarchy a bit differently, but at the very essence, being human means that we have a responsibility to each other. And so whether you call it leadership, that means you have to make an impact, or it's just being human and you need to make an impact. You have to get engaged
Yeah.
with the situation. But I want to go back to, because just talking with you, we could easily take this in many different directions, and because
Absolutely.
everything, all these little pieces are just kind of are the tip of different icebergs in the ocean that we can talk about.
Yeah.
But earlier there was a recognition that we are damaging the earth, because you
Mm-hmm.
actually used the word damage. And so
Yeah.
that's a significant word to use
Mm.
in a conversation that you're trying to tell people about the realities
Yeah.
of our current world, of the earth that we live on. And so
Mm.
the atypical amount of heat that we've had this summer, and you talked about it. You're across the Atlantic. I'm in Virginia,
Yeah.
USA, and you're across the Atlantic. We've had similar heat problems. I don't know if anybody's died of the heat situation here in America, but again, I'm not trying to track that data,
Mm.
but you are aware of it. And then you
Mm.
talked about a flood, and now there's, Hurricane Ian that just kind of moved up the
Yeah.
East Coast,
Yeah.
devastated, Florida, and that may or may not be, it's an atypical storm. It was a category 4 when it hit land.
Mm-hmm.
And so it went from category 1, which is the low end of the scale, to 4 in quite literally 24 hours, and did
Yeah.
devastated parts of Florida. So I don't know if we can contribute that to climate change, but it is a significant part of our ecosystem that we need to recognize, that we may be able to do things differently
Yes.
if we are aware that things need to be done differently.
Yeah.
But that's a lot of monologue, and I don't like the monologue in my own. But can you talk about the different areas of environmental damage that really do need to be talked about?
Well, so if we look at even in what you mentioned there, I was reading last week from an article by Catherine Cahill, who is a climate scientist based out of the US, and she felt, and I think it's important to do this, to outline that Hurricane Ian and other hurricanes are not happening as a result of climate change. They're not hugely
Oh,
more.
I wasn't, yeah, because we've had
Well, no,
hurricanes,
no, but
so
this is
I didn't mean to
yeah,
say that if I
yeah.
inferred that. So that was
No, no, but
my
I think it was an
error.
interesting point. It was an interesting point that I'll take up, because it might help to make it relatable as well. That not necessarily there are more hurricanes, but what you did mention was it was atypical. It started one way, and it's kind of quickly migrated another. It even changed direction quite rapidly.
Mhm.
So these are some of the effects of climate change, and that they're less predictable. These types of events are less predictable than they used to be.
Mm.
So climate change doesn't necessarily mean just warming, just heating. It can be the effects of that heating on the planet overall. And what we see then is, and it's already happening in some parts of the world, where they are either very close to or running almost below sea level because the sea levels are rising. So there's migration happening away from these locations.
Oh,
And it was interesting. The reason why I touched upon eco anxiety is because in the early stages of speaking with people, there was one mother who said to me, she's probably in her early 30s, but she said she has two children who were both below the age of 4.
mm,
And she and her husband had asked the question, did they do the wrong thing by having kids because of the choices they would have in the future?
wow. That
And I
is a
think
significant question.
it absolutely is.
Yeah.
And why wouldn't that cause anxiety for somebody? But what we see is that changing weather patterns, the damage that we're doing, the longer term damage that we're doing to let's say soil and so forth, means that the quality in some cases of produce that we're growing is not as high as it used to be. So we're using a lot more of these artificial ways of enhancing that growth, and that in itself is having a knock-on effect and this cyclical effect of damaging the soil. So in bygone years, well before either of our time, there was a more cyclical approach to farming, for instance, because they didn't necessarily have these chemicals or practices that we now have. As the population of the planet grows, we use more and more of the resources of the planet in order to feed ourselves or to make sure we have livable locations, whether that's cities or whether that's roads, whatever it might happen to be. These areas of the planet are that sustain us are reducing more and more. I can't recall the exact figure um, in terms of the amount of carbon that are the globally jungles take out of the atmosphere, but our jungles are reduced to about 7% of the planet, and they are the largest um, sink of carbon, for instance, that we rely upon. So for many people, and for scientists in particular, there's an air of, I will say, lack of hope or doom or whatever. And
Oh, don't say, well, those are bad words to use.
yeah, but you alluded to it to a certain extent, and I think there is the realities of climate change are quite stark. However, at the same time, there is hope, and we come back to this point of leadership again, because I think every one of the problems that we have now, whether they be big or small problems, have been created over the last 200, 250 years, or perhaps up to 400 years, by solving problems that existed before that. We as a race are fantastic at solving problems or at finding innovative ways of doing things. And the reality is that we actually know the majority of the technologies that are needed to propel us in a different direction. We know the policies that are needed. It just needs more people, more investment in those in order to influence positive change. And that's where leadership becomes important, because we as individuals can demonstrate, we can make ourselves aware to the extent that we need to be, and then demonstrate leadership in terms of whatever it is that we can do in our own lives, and then spread that influence to others as well. But because, again, there is reason for hope, because we are an ingenious race. We have evolved to where we are by solving problems effectively. If you look at it on a macro scale, we solve big problems, and the big problems that we now have to solve are ones that have effectively been created by us, but can also be solved by us in the very same way.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what you did. So you said you created a company, a nonprofit? Um,
It is not a nonprofit; it'll be a commercial organization. I think that's also important because I suppose there's a fear that we have to give up everything we have. We have to go towards um, uh, you know an economic model that doesn't necessarily support our current lifestyles or whatever. And certainly our economic models have to change. Sustainability is where true sustainability is where economy, society, and environment meet, and all three are considered. In an infinite growth economy, the society and the environment bit typically lose out a bit, but there's ways of balancing that. So I've specifically chosen that this should be a commercial organization
But what
making
is your
money.
organization doing? And so that's kind of what I didn't mean to go on a tangent, but so because you are at the intersection of leadership and climate change, and so
Mhm.
I'm thinking that you're in your talks with people, you are inspiring, you're motivating, and you are encouraging people to kind of take a step forward
Mhm.
and hopefully take on some responsibility.
Yeah, to a certain extent.
How are you doing
Yeah.
that?
So the intention, and I do say we're early stage. We've done a lot of talking and research into this. And again, what we want to try and do is give people the knowledge in the sense of, well, what is my current impact, or what are the current things that can be looked at that we can change? Give them insight into that, and then help them in their own way, whatever that is. So we talk about meeting people where they're at, and that means if it's somebody who from an emotional perspective is challenged by it, is anxious or whatever, to help address that first, actually validating that, okay, it's okay to feel this, um, but then giving them hope and giving them a plan around how they in their own lives first can take action. And it might be, so I'll give you an example. We're starting in Ireland first. We intend to expand into the EU, and there are other similar type services and products out there. But one of the data points we looked at was that if 50% of people in Ireland ate one less beef meal a week for a year, it would be the equivalent to taking every private car in Ireland off the road for 6 months. So what we try to do is make the information relatable to people. If we were to say, by eating less beef, your carbon footprint or your impact on the environment, the carbon equivalent is reduced by a ton, that doesn't mean much to anybody. I don't carry a ton of carbon around my back. I certainly don't know what it might look like.
Right.
But we're all aware that plane travel, that fossil fuel burning has something to do with this problem. And what we're trying to do is make that relatable for people and say, okay, for those who do understand that there is a relatable action. And it's not difficult to say, I would eat one less red meat meal a week for a year. But if all of these other people do it as well, so there's a sense of community and I'll say society, collective action there as well, that by showing people that, they can feel positive about it, but they can actually have an impact as well.
I like that. And so I don't even have a rebuttal for that because that was just beautiful. I mean, that's exactly what you would want to communicate, how it's directly impacting and how you could directly impact. So that
Mm-hmm.
reciprocity in behavior and responsibility. Um, just for the sake of time, because I would love to come back and have specific conversations about the specific
Mm-hmm.
subtopics that we've had talked about in just these 30 minutes. But earlier, and I always go back to what you said before earlier, you in one of your talks, a couple with young children came, asked the question, did we make the wrong decision?
Yeah.
And just curious, did you have a response and how did you respond to that? Because that would be an impossible question to answer, at
It,
least at face value.
It is an impossible question to answer at face value, certainly. And my way of looking at it, the reason why I got involved in this is to say we all have skills, we all have talents that we can use to have a positive influence. So I'm part of a community as well called Work and Climate, which is trying to get people into climate related work. But they also say at some point in time, all jobs will be climate related. So the reality is that if we focus on something we can have an influence on, and there is a collective focus then from those around, we absolutely can change it. So it doesn't mean that that it's the wrong choice to have children. It means that now that we know the things we should do, we can get about doing those things and actually make it a brighter future. Because you mentioned earlier as well, COVID and the impact that had on people. Being restricted to your homes or whatever meant that a lot of people started to look inwards.
Mhm.
And we are social animals. And we looked possibly to these things that would have given us that sort of dopamine hit, and they weren't as available to us. And I think we've become quite focused on those dopamine hits. And the reality is, if we can get engaged and involved in something that has bigger meaning, it has much more power than a short-term dopamine hit. It actually helps us feel empowered and feel more positive about what it is our contribution is, both to our own lives and to the lives of our future generations. And I do think that um, while we need to dig into it from an ELTC, the Earth point of view, and figure out ways of encouraging that in people, I think ultimately that discussion of hope and what we can do about that hope and turning that into action is fundamentally what will make a difference for ourselves and our future generations.
So give us, in 1 minute or less, a word of hope for our audience, please.
So I'm going to refer back to a statement I made earlier, which is that yes, we do know the areas of damage that let's say fossil fuels or certain activities that we have, even the consumerism that exists on the planet, the extent of it, and the impact that's having on the planet. But at the same time, we also know all of the technologies, and a lot of them are proven, that will help us get beyond that. We know the policies that need to be put in place as well, and there are good examples. Um, uh, the um, the Climate Act that was put in place in the US, and there are similar ones across Europe as well, that are beginning to influence change in a positive way, sometimes through regulation, because that's a necessity to get people thinking about these things.
Mhm.
But we do know those things, and all it really takes is more attention, and let those leaders, those current leaders, understand that we expect to see that leadership from them, and we are pushing them in our own way by leading in our own direction to encourage more of that change.
Damien, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I appreciate this conversation. And again, I do hope that we get to have another one and maybe more than just one more. But we can decide that at a later time.
Absolutely.
This has been a fantastic, and it has been eye-opening for me because again, it's not a conversation that I have even in my own
Mm-hmm.
house. And
Mm-hmm.
so the more I'm aware, the more I can make personal, responsible decisions for me and my family, and hopefully for my local community. This has been,
Keith,
see, yes, Damien, go ahead.
sorry, thank you very much, Keith. I do really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak, and as usual, it's been fantastic to be able to share this with you.
Well, this has been the Question Guy podcast, and we'll see you next time. Take care.